Hello, and welcome back to another New Jewish Narrative webinar. I'm Max Albert-Deitch, and with me here is our Development Director, Karen Paul. Our guest today is Dr. Elana Sztokman. She is an anthropologist, educator, feminist, peace activist, speaker, podcaster, and two-time winner of the National Jewish Book Council Award. She has spent 25 years writing about issues of gender, language, power, politics, education, and society, especially centered around Israel and Jewish culture. We are specifically here to talk about her newest book, In My Jewish State, which came out just a few weeks ago. I would hold up a proper copy of it, but I did read it as an ebook. In this book, Dr. Sztokman uses her professional skills of rhetorical analysis cultivated from years of anthropological research and unpacks the language and ideas that drive the pro-Israel advocacy movement and that are really used to justify cruel actions and attitudes, as I think all of us have seen over the last couple years especially. In the process, she makes some drastic personal changes, shifts her own Jewish identity, and advocates for a different vision of what it means to live in a Jewish state. Elana, we are absolutely thrilled to have you here with us today. How are you? How does it feel to have this newest book of yours out in the world?
So first of all, thank you. Thank you, Max and Karen, for inviting me. And congratulations on this new organization, on your merger. And it's exciting news. And I'm, really rooting for your success and growth and impact on Jewish life everywhere. So it's an honor to be here, especially, that my new book came out. It feels really urgent, actually, to tell you the truth. We're living in a time of like daily emergencies, life and death emergencies, so many around us. And I feel like I very much want to help contribute to the end of that, to the end of just so much wasted life, for the wrong reasons. So that's why this book, feels really just like so important to me right now, possibly like the most urgent thing I've ever written, to tell you the truth. Yeah, so I really appreciate you having me here. Mm,
Well, we're really happy to have you, Alana.
mm.
As we just talked about a few minutes ago, your book opens with your personal experience on October 7th, and that leads you to conversations with schoolmates, well, former schoolmates, of course,
Yeah,
opening yourself up to the recognition that you're just existing on a different plane. Can you walk us through those experiences and sort of
yeah,
tell us the story of how you were raised and how the questions began to
yeah,
bubble up?
yeah. So, yeah, because I guess in order for me to really tell the story about why I wrote the book, I do have to go back like 40 or 50 years. That's the truth, you know. So I'm going to try to do that fast.
Okay.
So, I'm from Brooklyn, New York, not the hipster Brooklyn, with its rainbow pride bagels and celebrities and hipsters and black hats and beards. I grew up in the other Brooklyn, the one by Avenue J, with, glatt kosher bagels and rabbi celebrities, and where the black hat and beard means something else entirely. So the Brooklyn that I grew up with in the 70s and 80s, it was a post 1967 era of Israeli infallibility, of Jewish religious pride, of NCSY, B'nai Akiva, Soviet Union demonstrations, Rabbi Avi Weiss chaining himself to the White House, JDL running the streets of Brooklyn, Meir Kahane, who is the godfather of Ben Gvir. I always say, like, in order to understand Ben Gvir, you have to go back to Meir Kahane, which takes you to Avenue J, which is where I, grew up. It was the time when we as Jews sort of, or at least where I was, Brooklyn, and that Brooklyn, you sort of believed that, we were better than everyone else, that we had some kind of like secret line to God, and we knew exactly what God wanted, and that we were doing a great job, whatever it was. And so part of that, of course, was Zionism. And in the school that I went to, Zionism was core against the backdrop of, Meir Kahane, who incidentally also studied the same yeshiva I did. So, already in ninth grade, we had a mandatory course in Zionism with a legendary teacher who I call Tomer in the book. He was also the son of the school principal, and he was this great teacher. He was clear and impassioned and, charismatic and young and totally unconcerned with things like attendance and grades. And, he would like sit there eating his pizza and talk. It was sort of like a combination of a TED talk and a prep for an APAC convention, and he made everything seem so neat and easy and uncomplicated. He answered little questions. What is Judaism? What is Zionism? Zionism is religious nationalism. He gave us all these answers, and he gave us, a sense of purpose and identity and meaning and all those things, connection that we really wanted. But within all that were a lot of, political messages that, as 14-year-olds, we didn't necessarily have the tools or the ability to unpack properly. So, in teaching us that Zionism is Jewish nationalism, he also taught us things like Jordan is really Palestine, that there's no such thing as a Palestinian nation, that Palestinian self-determination is not a real thing, that Palestinians aren't a real thing, that, there's no such thing as anti-Israel, is only anti-Semitism, and it's all the same, that we deserve this land because it says so in the Torah, also other things like he would give us, responses to claims about Deir Yassin, for example. Like, did we know what Deir Yassin was? No. I mean, most of the people, most of the 14-year-olds had never been to Israel. My first time going to Israel was with my family when I was 12, but it was still like, you know, Palestinian narratives, we didn't know anything about that, but we were given all of these answers before we understood how to ask the questions, and within that narrative was all the things we really wanted, which were meaning and connection. So, I ate it up. I loved it. He was my favorite teacher, Tomer. He was my favorite. And actually, this class was a big reason why I decided to live in Israel. By the time I was 16, I was telling people that I planned on making Aliyah. In fact, I was here in Israel by the time I was 23, married with a baby, with my head covering and my long skirt and all of that. And I had all the answers. I knew exactly who I was, and everything was good and right, until it wasn't. So just for transparency, I wanted to say that I did not question all that for a very long time. And a big part of that was because I was busy fixing my life, right, from other perspectives. I became very active when I was 25. When my second child was born, I became a sort of a very active feminist because, that was my first transformation of going from being the gatekeeper of the patriarchy to an orthodox feminist. When I was 26 or so, I took off my hat and skirt. I got married when I was 21, became a mother when I was 22. I did all the orthodox things the way you were supposed to. But then, a few years later, I started questioning and unpacking all of that, what's called change from within. I wasn't paying attention to all of that political stuff outside. I didn't have like the bandwidth to do it all at once. So I spent a lot of years first unpacking the patriarchy and making that like my life mission. So, and I did all that, and I became very active in women's tefillah groups and partnership minyan and the Aguna issue and all of that. Um, and then at a certain point, those feminist tools had a sort of unanticipated effect on me, which is that it sort of gave me permission to question things and also to question issues of power, because so much of what I was brought up on, what I thought was true, I discovered was a lot of power wielding, and that sort of made me start digging and asking some questions. So the turning point came for me, the first turning point, one of many. It's not like one pivot point, it's several. But the biggest one that I think about when I think about how I changed was somewhere around 2009 when I landed this position as a writer for a so-called media monitoring organization. Like media monitoring sounds so like neutral, but it wasn't really neutral at all. My job was to write organizational copy that counters anything that was considered pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel, which meant that my assignments were, here is an article in which a Palestinian is speaking, prove that Palestinian is lying. That was literally my job assignment. And at a certain point, this was feeling really uncomfortable to me. And I came into a staff meeting one day and I said, why can't we let Palestinians have their story, their narrative, their life story? And it was like silence. It was like deer in headlights, because that was not something that people said. What we said was Palestinians are all lying. Next day I was fired. And so that sort of set me on a little bit of a journey. That was like a sort of shocking kind of experience. But it also sort of validated something in me, which was that something here was really not feeling right. The idea that, like, if we have to prove ourselves, if we have to prove our righteousness by saying that everyone who criticizes us is lying, I thought that's a really poor defense, you know? And so decided to start studying more, to study because, in our years in yeshiva, when we were told, Palestinians are this and Palestinians are that, and they're lying about this and lying about that. None of us had ever met a Palestinian or spoken to a Palestinian or read anything by a Palestinian, but like we knew everything. We knew better than the Palestinians who they are and so I started really saying to myself, that just feels wrong. And also the feminist aspect also played into it because like I knew how that feels. I know how that feels as a woman when they're like talking over you and telling you that they know more about your motives than you do. They, people with power know more about us as women, and I was like, I kind of understand how that feels, and that just feels really wrong. So I started a whole different journey where I started to listen. I started like probably 10 years, I would say, of like listening and learning. I went looking for places to actually meet Palestinians and engage with Palestinians as equals, as human beings. I mean, I know that sounds like a radical idea, to be, I don't know, I was probably close to 40 and still not having had done that. I'm sorry, I'm like a little embarrassed to admit that, but okay, here we are. So I'm just telling you that, I started to do that to sort of say like, okay, what's going on here? So I did all kinds of things. I went to weekends. I did nonviolent communication weekends with Palestinian Jewish women. I went to sulha events. I went to interfaith conferences. I went on tours of the West Bank. I went on joint to the Jewish Palestinian memorial services. I went to peace trainings. I went on yoga for peace building and pretty much anything that I could find. Meetings, conferences, events, iftars. I visited Palestinian villages. I had conversations about issues like water, land grabs, and so much, I didn't want to believe, like, I didn't want to believe that there's a such thing as Jewish settler violence. I remember those first reactions of feeling like, that can't be right, that can't be true. Really? Uprooting olive trees? Isn't that something that people are making up? But it was true. And I had to face it. And I sort of just came to a place in my life where I said, we need to face this. I toured the wall. Went to places in East Jerusalem where the wall had completely destroyed people's like everyday lives. I spoke to women whose lives were destroyed because they can't see their husbands who live on different parts of the Green Line and things like that. So, these were like eye-opening experiences. And I went to them with as much of, an open heart and an open eyes and open ears as I could, and I did that. And I started to, get angry. Do you know what I mean? I thought about some of the things that Palestinians were going through, and I felt like something here is just very, very wrong. And then came October 7th, right? So, you know, already just October 7th, by the way, came after a year of a lot of protests in Israel, not about the occupation, not about Palestinians, but still a lot of people coming to a place where they're like, Bibi does not represent us. The Likud does not represent us. Right-wing religious Zionism does not represent us. So that was sort of happening, even if it wasn't necessarily about these issues per se. But then came October 7th. So on the morning of October 7th at 6:30 in the morning, I was lying in my bed in my sleepy town of Modi'in, where I've been for around 20 years. And I was thinking to myself, wow, my upstairs neighbor is doing quite the workout this morning because I kept getting bangs on the ceiling as if they were like dropping these 20-kilo weights. And it kept happening. And then meanwhile, my windows were rattling. And then my phone starts going, and my phone is pinging, ping, 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 rattle, 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 bang, 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 all of that. And suddenly I sat up and I thought to myself, what is going on? And remember, this is a Shabbat, it's Simchat Torah, it's a holiday. You know, I picked up my phone and it was my daughter pinging me. My daughter who lived at the time in Ashkelon, which is close to the Gaza border. And she wrote me, she said, Ima, we're under attack. We're on our way to you. And I was like, what? She wrote, we're going to be there in an hour. So I sort of sat up and I started looking at the news and all of that and getting ready for her husband and her 3-month-old baby. They showed up about an hour later and stayed for about 3 months. Well, except for my son-in-law, who by the end of the day was already in reserve duty, which he did for 11 months and then came home for about 6 weeks. And now he's back doing reserve duty again. Also on October 7th, my other daughter who lives in Beersheba with her, was in her safe room with her 2.5-year-old babies and two little potties because they were in the middle of potty training her twins, and she was 8 months pregnant. She also showed up by the end of the day, also stayed for about 3 months. Her husband also was reported to duty by the end of the day. He got out when she gave birth, stayed for about 3 days, and then was called right back. She was like hoping he would at least get like a week or two. Did not. He is also currently back in reserve duty, his, I don't know, fourth round or something. He's doing a 2-month stint, and she's got, 3 kids under the age of 3.5. And okay, so that's my son lives in Haifa. He also reported for duty by the end of the day. His wife was also 8 months pregnant. He at least got out in time for the baby, but then also went back to do about another, I think, 2 or 3 rounds. I don't know. He just got out a couple of weeks ago from his most recent round. And then my youngest, I have 4 kids. My youngest is 21. She was doing her compulsory duty as in Tatspi, the lookouts. The Tatspi girls, the lookout girls, who 5 of them just got released from hostages. It's this one of my biggest thoughts about October 7th was that about a year before, when my daughter was trying to figure out where she was going to be posted in Tatspi, it was this coin flip, right? They said either Maccabim next to our house or Re'im, right, which is the one on the border, which was next to Gaza, which was attacked. And we were like, stay here, close to home. That sounds really nice. And she said, no, 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 I want to go. I want to go to the Gaza border. It's much more interesting. And it was like this complete coin flip that she got sent here and not there. And I think about that all the time, like how like the a hair, that's how close we were to like all of that. And I can't really think about this too often because it sort of makes me like shudder. But I'm telling you all of this. Why am I telling you all these details? Just in case somebody here is thinking to themselves, Elana doesn't get it. She doesn't understand what October 7th was, which I get all the time, like literally all the time. I get on Facebook last week, somebody said, well, if you lived in Israel, you wouldn't be saying the things you say, or like, you really don't understand October 7th. You should really watch some videos about October 7th. Like, I get that all the time. So, I tell you all this just to like give you my creds, okay, just to tell you I understand October 7th. Okay.
So,
So,
Alana, if I could just
yes.
interrupt for a second. So if you
Sorry,
could,
yes.
yeah, so if you could take that experience and then tell us more about what you described at the beginning of the book, which is these
Yeah.
conversations that you have
Yeah.
with your
With
schoolmates
my,
with
right.
who are saying the same thing that you don't know what you're talking about,
Right. Exactly.
and putting you in that. And then I want to pivot after that to talk about women in the army and the language of
Sure.
war and government and all those things. So let's get to all of
Sure.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically the next day I got added to my yeshiva alumni WhatsApp group, which was doing a whole, pro-Israel thing. And they were sharing, first of all, they were sharing all these like very right-wing things, about how we have to raise Gaza, and there's no such thing as a all Gazans are guilty and they're all terrorists and all that. And I and Tomer was in the group. I was like, Tomer, he was our teacher like 40 years ago, and he's still sharing all of these like radical religious right-wing stuff, and everybody's looking to him. And I was like, really? Like for 40 years nothing has changed? And that sort of, and so two things happened. So one is that I started to give some alternative views. I said, to the moderator, who I thought was my friend, I said, that Palestinians are human beings. There are 2.2 million people in Gaza that you're talking about, they all deserve to die. And she wrote back to me, she said, we're really worried about you. Maybe you should just go back to your grandmother duties and, leave the thinking to us, kind of thing. Like, she, in one fell swoop, rendered me as like old and mentally disabled. And because I dared to, go against the um, party line, as it were, this 50-year-old party line, like there must be something wrong with me. So that was really eye-opening for me, about how little all of this has changed, and also about how it's like full circle. It's the same thing. It's the stuff that I was brought up with on Avenue J, is the same stuff. The Americana JDL stuff that infiltrated, my education, is still here. And then I'm like, of course it's still here, because we have, all these, Ben Gvir got 15 mandates. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of my classmates who voted for him. So it's here. It's the same thing, and it's so that's I really started to, I feel like, once I started seeing all these things, especially on social media, I kept seeing these same arguments. The same arguments that I was hearing in 1982 are still here, but now they've got these fancy memes and the ability to share in social media, very fast and in very sort of clever, cutesy ways. And I thought, I really just have to like talk back to this. And so I spent a lot of the war, among other things, collecting these. I started to just collect all of these memes that reflected the same messages that I was hearing when I was a kid. And I decided to talk back to them and analyze them. I put on my anthropologist hat and I started to, content analysis of these, what the messages were. And that's what this book became. I was also doing it in lots of other settings. I was I was arguing with people on social media. I still do that, even though it's a really bad idea. I still do it, and I started a podcast about also almost a year ago with my Palestinian partner Eva Dalak, and we interview lots of people, lots of women. It's called Women Ending War. And we interview women who have different ideas, who are trying to promote a different idea, who are trying to combat the dehumanization. Because that's at the core of this. What I'm talking about here is this very systematic polemic, this systematic rhetoric aimed at dehumanizing Palestinians. And by dehumanizing Palestinians, that gives justification to do whatever it is that we want to do, we, Israel, which is some really bad things. We are doing some really terrible things in Gaza and in the West Bank. 50,000, Gazans dead, including about 20,000 babies. 90% of Gaza is completely destroyed. We have no idea how people are going to rebuild. It's even there's so much rubble in Gaza, and the rubble is filled with explosives and dead bodies. I mean, can you imagine this? And so you have people saying things like, well, look what happened on October 7th, and it's like, we can't do that. We can't justify our own actions by saying, look what happened on October 7th. It's not okay. We can't say, well, we're upset that so many innocent people were killed, and then we go and kill 40 times as many. I mean, that's what we're doing. So that's what this book is. This book is a combination of a little bit of my backstory to explain where I came from, again, to give me my, creds, why I really do understand. But mostly I want it to be it's this analysis of these messages and how we have to talk back to the messages of dehumanization. Because the dehumanization is at the core, and that's at the core of the immorality of it, and I want us to stop doing that. I want us meaning like the Jewish people mostly. I'm talking mostly to the Jewish people in this book. I want us as a people to be better, to not fall into those traps of dehumanization, of justifying so many terrible things. Not in my name. Not in my name. The Israeli army and Bibi are doing these things in my name. And I'm like, no, 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 no. So this book is supposed to be tools for talking back to that, to be able to point to it, to give it a name and say, no, that is wrong. Because that's what Audre Lorde said. Audre Lorde said you have to give a name to the thing in order to see it. So I want to give a name to this rhetoric, to the dehumanizing rhetoric, so that we point to it and we could say, no, that's wrong. I don't want to participate in it. That's it.
So that's precisely what you did in really the entire second section of the book, which is dedicated to parsing this language of occupation and violence against Palestinians. Could you maybe do a very quick review of the four basic themes of language, and how things like the Israeli army is the most moral army in the world, and how this toxicity works to kind of quash empathy and really eliminate the idea of a roadmap towards any kind of peace?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So there are four main themes. So the themes meaning like ideas that come out of the pro-Israel rhetoric. So one is that we as Israelis or Jews are good and do no wrong, that we're righteous, that the IDF is the most moral army in the world, and that whole mythology. But also like denying that we do anything wrong, like denying that there's even discrimination in Israel, denying that there's apartheid, denying that occupation exists. Like, oh, if you use the word occupation, then clearly you're anti-Semitic kind of thing. So it's like, all of that whole thing, like Israelis and Jews do no wrong. That's number one. Number two is Palestinians, on the other hand, are all bad and completely at fault. So, we hear a lot of things like, oh, there's no such thing as innocent Palestinians. I mean, the Israeli government says that often. I mean, we heard that in The Hague. Some of these things, actually, we also heard in The Hague coming out of, the Israeli leaders. So it's things like there are no innocent Palestinians. Palestinians don't value life, but Jews do. We value life. They, don't. They don't care about their children. Also, other things like Palestinians have no culture. They have no history, which of course we learned in yeshiva, in yeshiva, that Palestinians don't exist. They have no culture. They have no history. They're all just terrorists. They all just want, killing. They all care only about guns. And on some level, it's also that they're also not really normal. They're not normal human, that they're all liars, all of that. Okay, so that's number two. So number one was Israeli Jews are all good. Palestinians are all bad. The third is Israeli Jews are the real victims, which is a whole turning things on their head and making sure that the power hierarchy is, that they are hurting us and we are just, victims. Okay, so that gets to one of the core issues, which is that any criticism of Israel is cast as anti-Semitism. I don't know if you've seen the book, the film Israelism. Israelism does a very good job of analyzing this also, about how criticism of Israel is cast as it's just anti-Semitism. It's the same thing as, the Nazis. It's the same thing as Paro wanted to throw all the Jewish babies into the water. It's all the same story, which gives you this kind of protection against criticism. You can't criticize it because, you're all anti-Semites, and Jews are the real victims. And then, and sometimes it goes even further, that anti-Semitism drives all political discourse. And then also that October 7th was the Holocaust. October 7th is, had a lot of terrible things. It was a terrible thing. And what we're seeing with the hostages is terrible. And they really did look like they were coming, the three men who came out a few days ago did absolutely look like they were coming out of the camps. However, that does not mean that what happened on October 7th is the same thing as the Holocaust. And we could talk about that for a while. But anyway, okay, so that's number three. So number one was Israelis are good, Jews are good. Number two is Palestinians are bad. Three is Israel, Jews are the real victims. And the fourth is, of course, as a result of all this, everything Israel does is justified. So we have language of things like, inevitability, the war of no choice, things like that, that Israel has no choice. You hear that, all the time. And also now, because we have this religious government, it sort of meshes into this whole idea of God's war. There's a ton of God language and this God's mission kind of thing. And there's a lot of religion that has infiltrated the army, and there's a lot of things going around that. And, once you do that, once you're on this religious mission, it gets back to all Palestinians deserve to die. This is God's will. And again, that sort of justifies everything. So that in short is are the messages that I try to unpack. And it's really not only social media, even though most of what I used is social media. Everything pretty much is what I used in the book is social media. But you could do the same analysis with texts coming out of the government, and texts happening in schools, and lots of other things. So really, it's not just social media. But I used social media because it was the most striking sometimes, these cutesy cartoons saying really terrible things. It was just so jarring at certain points. And also that's the world we live in. We live in a social media world. So I felt like that's where so much of the battle is. But these messages are everywhere.
Ilana, something that really struck me about this book is that it's so much more conversational than much of your previous work, which makes sense. You come from academia. But I think in some ways it's almost necessary that it has to be, because in so many ways it's about empathy. It's about reaching across a divide, building a bridge instead of building that divide and making it further. So can you talk a little bit about how this process differed from some of your more academic work? Did you approach it differently from the start?
Yes. Yeah, it is different, and it was a very conscious decision. For most of my writing career, I really prefer not to talk about myself. It's only sort of recently, it's only in the past couple of years that I've started to talk about my own stuff. It's sort of first of all, it sometimes feels like shaming, to sort of reveal your mistakes. And, sometimes writing my own history, I feel dumb, you know? I feel like, oh my God, I was like this dumb little yeshiva girl sometimes. And I sort of, so it's hard to do that. Okay. And also, it also feels very unfeminist, right? Because one of the issues with women's experiences is that like we're not taken seriously for our authority. We're only taken seriously if we like cry, if we like, if we fall into all kinds of caricatures. And that really is hard for me. And I really don't like falling into that trap. But that's also the world we live in. We live in this sort of like confessional world. So I sort of like, I'm just sort of going with what is at a certain point. I realize that in order to be heard, you have to expose yourself a little bit. In order to be respected, also, you have to be expose yourself and, deal with the gender issues with whatever it is. It just is. But also at a certain level, it also is a little bit cathartic, despite myself. Despite the fact that I would rather be seen as, a thinker than as like you know, poor her. I also don't want to use my kids as like proof of everything. I really hate doing that, even though I did this in this call. I don't like having to say, well, I'm a mother of this and I did this in my life and therefore I'm worth, speaking to. I would much rather say, hey, I wrote a doctorate about this. Do you know what I mean? Like that feels much more comfortable for me. But okay, this is the world we're in right now, and I'm okay. And again, there was something a little bit like healing for me also, in that even though it is like there are things that I feel shame about in my own history, like I'm okay, okay. I do a lot of writing workshops and things, and I read about writing. I take writing courses. I've been doing that for like 30 years. And in this one writing course, this teacher I had who teaches people about writing memoir, she said, before you sit down to write memoir, you have to ask yourself, what are the things that are most shaming for you? And that is the thing you have to write about. So that's a course I took in the middle of COVID. It was a COVID course that I was doing, and I sat down to do that, and I was like, really, I really don't want to. Like, I really, really don't want to be doing this. But I did it, and I kept that in mind, when I was doing this, and I thought, okay, I have to be like whatever it is that I am. I have to just be true to myself as it is. And so, yes, I'm an academic. Yes, I have a brain. But yes, I also have lots of life experiences. And okay, it's all some kind of michlol. It's a kind of like collection of our identities. And okay, okay.
We were talking to two writers here, so we appreciate that.
Yes, nodding along.
Hearing about the
Not
process.
everybody wants. So, Elana, one of the projects that drew us to wanting to be in conversation with you here in the first place, and also for many of our listeners, I suspect some of you also listen to the podcast that Elana co-hosts, Women Ending War.
Wow, that's so cool. Okay.
I think a lot of our regular Peacecast listeners do also tune into that. We often find ourselves on similar lists because you're in conversation with a Palestinian citizen of Israel, bringing your experiences and ideas to the conversation together. And the thing that I really
Yeah.
want to ask you about is you did an episode where you had gone to the Nova Festival site. And
Oh,
if I remember correctly, what she said was, this land is screaming out for peace. And you
yeah.
felt really compelled to enter that conversation and be in that space with her. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience doing that and also with the podcast? Because you've been in the space for really quite a
Yeah.
while, really doing the work.
Yeah, that was a really intense experience going with Eva to the Nova Festival. It was a really, really intense day. But it was also really important to me. Um, it was really important to me to be able to hold space for that. And that's complicated, right? Because, especially now, like her family, a lot of her family's in Gaza. She's had a lot of losses in Gaza. Most of her family actually is in Gaza. Her mother, she grew up in Jaffa, but that's only because her grandmother gave birth the day in 1947, November 1947, when they all had to, or it wasn't, sorry, it was not November 1947, it was April 1948, right? She tells the whole story. She tells the story a lot. But anyway, in April 1948, after the Deir Yassin thing, the Deir Yassin massacre really affected them. And her family was all leaving Jaffa to go to part in Gaza and part in Nablus, except for her grandmother, who was 9 months pregnant and starting to go into labor. And so she turned back around and went to Jaffa and gave birth to Eva's mother, which is how Eva's family landed in Jaffa, while all the rest of her family is in in Gaza and in Nablus. So her family has suffered tremendously. Okay. So still within that, I want to still make space for understanding that October 7th is a trauma for Israelis. And that's sometimes hard to do. Like there are some Palestinians who can't hear it, and sometimes she can't hear it. Sometimes I want to talk about October 7th, and she says, well, October 7th didn't start on October 7th, it started in 1948. And, October 7th just brought the conflict into Israeli living rooms, like that. So you hear that a lot, not just from Eva, you hear that from a lot of Palestinians. And that's hard. Okay, that's hard because, like, I want permission to have my own trauma also. Um, but, making space for all of that is complicated. To add to that, so she had never been to Nova. She had never been to the OTF to sorry to the she had never been to the Gaza envelope, and so this was new for her, and I felt her like starting to understand me. Like also when we passed by Ashkelon, and I said, yeah, my daughter was living in Ashkelon, and she had to run away to our house, and here's where she saw, you know, burnt up, bloodied cars and gun-ridden cars. And she, my daughter tells that story and stuff. So I shared that with Eva, and she started to like understand me a little bit. And then, so we're there at the Nova Festival site, and she's saying that like you could just like you're just surrounded by these images, 300 or 400 images of young people who were just dancing, and like it's overwhelming. It's really. And then as we're standing there, suddenly we have this massive boom. And so we both looked, and I said to her, she didn't even know. I said, yeah, that's Gaza. That's the Israeli army bombing Gaza. And then like a minute later, we heard it again, and so and the ground shook. It was like 10 kilometers away, but the ground is like shaking from that. And that was really it was like in this moment when I wanted to just, I wanted to bring Eva into my space for a second, just for, just like one episode. I wanted her to share my experience. We couldn't even do that entirely because for the people for the people of Nova, this is it's a year over. It happened a year ago. The families are mourning, except for the hostages. Like there's a whole hostage thing, which is its own story. But like the people who died, their families are mourning. But the people in Gaza are still being bombed relentlessly, and with these massive bombs and their houses being destroyed and with no, containment, no restraint. So the day ended up being more about Gaza than about Nova. I mean, it was like a little bit of both, you know what I mean? But it was like it's hard to even make space to talk about October 7th when we're still doing that. So that was and then afterwards it was a hard day. I think it was important. I think it was in some ways maybe transformative because it was Eva's first time there. And like having these conversations where it's like your trauma counts and my trauma counts, and at the end of the day they're all bad and we should stop all of it, and we are on the same side because we are anti-violence and anti-dehumanization. So really, why are we bothering to talk about us and them? The only us and them are, there's us who don't want violence and there are them who want violence. That's how the world is now divided from my perspective. So, but this is hard. My podcast is hard work. It's very, very hard work. It's hard emotional work. It's hearing a lot of really painful, traumatic stories. It's having to own what, Israeli leaders are doing in my name. It's hard. And you're doing it in the middle of like also me trying to grapple with my own stuff and grapple with the hostages and what this whole thing means. It's not easy, but that's the work. This is the work. This is the work that we need to be doing. It's so important. It just feels so important.
And this is the work. And actually one of the things that you describe, sort of your mantra for this work is saying that you connect before you correct. And that just feels like deeply feminist and deeply radical to me. So I really appreciated that perspective on how you do this.
That's a mantra from nonviolent communication. That's the nonviolent communication world. They live by that. Yeah, they taught it to me. We had 2 interviewees from nonviolent communication. They came on and taught that to us.
Yeah. Could we take a step towards the end of the book, which talks about the 4 possibilities of how to share land that might bring
Mm,
forth a peaceful solution, and your own feelings about the possibility of peace?
sure. So the 4 solutions, which I learned through my involvement with a group called the 1325 Forum, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 calls for women's involvement and all things having to do with peace and security. So at the beginning of this war, a coalition of women got together to advance solutions. So when we think about solutions, often we hear about the two-state solution, but the two-state solution is really only one. The other solutions are a binational state and a federalism and a confederation, which are like all kinds of different variations of like the EU would be like a confederation. It's like states that are loosely combined as opposed to America, which is more of a federalism, which are states that are more tightly combined. There are all kinds of different versions of it. You know, I don't necessarily want to take a position on which one is the most important because like that's not my area of expertise. I'm not I'm not a political analyst in that sense. I am a social observer. Um,
Mm.
but I do think that through this work, not just with the podcast and not just with Forum 1325, but just in general, listening to Palestinians and Jews and living my life, I feel like for me, the two-state solution doesn't really speak to me anymore. It really, and I know that's like a really controversial thing to say because, there have been times where it's like, oh, binationalism, but that's going to end the Jewish state and all of that. So, for me, I would like to live in a place where all the people living here are equal. We all have equal rights. We're all considered equal citizens. You know, from the river to the sea, it's like, that's what Palestinians are saying, and that's what Jews want. So we all want the same land. You want to hear something like really also a little bit hard. Some people will find this hard to hear, but Eva wears a necklace that looks like the map of JNF. Okay? She wears a
Wow.
gold necklace that is a map of the river to the sea. Okay? So Eva's vision of this land is the exact same as that of many Jews. We all want the exact same land, and we're all here. There are roughly 7 to 8 million Jews and 7 to 8 million Palestinians from the river to the sea, more or less. I mean, unless Trump, somehow removes 2.2 million or whatever. Let's not go there. But anyway, it's roughly 50-50, give or take, and I just really want to live in a place where all human beings are human beings. We all have our needs met. We all have our needs for equality, justice, freedom of movement. You know, we all have this security. We all need security. We all need safety, security, and equality and justice, and the right to our homes, and the right to be free in our homes, and the right to live according to the law of the land. Where there's laws that apply to all of us equally. That's where I want to live, and that seems to me the only feasible future for this country because what we're doing now is not feasible. It's not feasible. What, endless bloodshed forever? I mean, good people are already leaving. 80,000 Israelis left this year since the start of the war. Good people are leaving, and you can't blame them. Haredim aren't leaving. Haredim who don't pay taxes and don't serve in the army are staying, and having lots of babies. But okay, so what exactly is the future of this country if we're not going to like think bigger? The problem is that to think that way, it means we have to rethink what it means to be a Jewish state because so much of what we were brought up on to be a Jewish state means absolute Jewish minority, so that Jews rule, so that Jews govern, so that Jewish everything, counts and matters and has power, Jewish language and Jewish holidays and Jewish cultures and all of that. And of course, the safe haven for Jews. And so what I would like to see is I would like to see all those things still exist to a certain degree, meaning like Jewish culture still exists, Jewish language, Jewish holidays, Shabbat, Jewish protection, Jewish safe haven, all of that to exist without insisting on this, like, well, we have to be this absolute majority. Because to be the absolute majority, by definition, means that we have to oppress lots of people. And so that is not sustainable. So we have to rethink what it means to be a Jewish state. So what does it really mean to be a Jewish state? To be a Jewish state means it's safe for Jews, that Jews have rights, that Jews will always be welcome here, that Jews can speak Hebrew, and have Shabbat and Chagim and all of those things. Yes, we could do that. without oppressing anybody along the way. That the other people who live here, whoever they happen to be, also have their holidays and their language and their culture and their safety and the security and their safe haven. Also, that that is the vision. And it takes reconfiguring in our brain. It's like that sound of waves making when it's reconfigured. Okay, we got to reconfigure that. We got to reconfigure it because what we're
Yeah.
doing to try to sustain that idea of an absolute Jewish minority, an absolute Jewish majority, is so wrong. It is just wrong, and it's wrong, and it leads to so many other wrong things. So we've got to change that whole concept in our brains, as painful as that is. It's painful for some people to let that go, but okay, what we're living in now is also very painful, and this is worse. So let's think better, you know.
We have to write a new Jewish narrative.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
exactly. So I have one more question, then I know Max has one more question as well. So going back to the book again, you say it is the longest war in Israel's history, and there are
Yeah.
no women in decision-making positions
Yeah,
anywhere
none.
having anything to do with it. And this, of course, makes me
Yeah,
think of the young women who were the spotters that you mentioned
yeah,
earlier,
yeah,
who the higher ups didn't listen to, and look what happened.
yeah,
Um, can you talk a little bit more about Israeli and Palestinian women and peacemaking?
yeah. So I belong to like so many different kinds of women's groups, and there are all kinds of women's groups that have popped up since the beginning of this war. So, while so much of Israel has taken, two steps to the right, there's also a grassroots flourishing, led by women. It's hard to see, I have like 20 WhatsApp groups that like are pinging all day long with this stuff. So it's there, it doesn't yet have the same power as the people around the table making the everyday decisions about the war. But it's definitely there, okay? And we definitely have a shared language. I had this experience last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, was it? We were recording a podcast in Bethlehem. It was my first time in Bethlehem. It was a little bit illegal. I mean, it was illegal. It was illegal for me to be there, and I had to
Right.
drive through different. I mean, it's surreal. The whole thing is surreal. But anyway, we were there to interview a Palestinian Christian woman. Her name is Amir Salam, who's been in Bethlehem for hundreds of years. Her 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 grandfather was the mayor of Bethlehem, and recently, like in July, she had this terrible experience where a group of violent settlers came and forcibly took away her family land. Okay, so this is a woman who's been there for like forever. Okay, since like the 1500s or the 1600s, she said, and the IDF was supporting settlers. She said before October 7th, the IDF would try to stop that kind of violence. And now, since Ben Gvir, actually, it wasn't even October 7th, it was since Ben Gvir came into power that Ben Gvir now sort of uses the IDF to support all this kind of violence. Anyway, so she's telling the story, and and she's also she's got a blue ID card, meaning like she can go back and forth in Israel, and so she talked a lot about her experiences in Israel and her experiences with Israelis and how many Israelis have come to help her. She talked a lot about organizations like Rabbis for Human Rights and Maxome Watch, and probably Peace Now, wherever Peace Now is in Israel. So she talked about how meaningful that was to her, and she was talking about those connections, the connections between groups that are trying to prevent violence. She's active in this thing called nonviolent civilian actors or something like. I'm saying it wrong. There's a specific term for civilians coming unarmed to protect people who are experiencing injustice. It's like a universal thing, and this is what these groups come. And she talked about how meaningful that was for her. And I was looking at us sitting there, and it was Amira who's Christian, and Eva who's Muslim, and it's me who's Jewish, American Israeli Jewish, and we're all like nodding along to these ideas, to the ideas of nonviolence, to the idea of showing up for justice, and we were totally speaking the same language. We were like 100% speaking the same language, and I was just all of a sudden like looking at this room and thinking like we're on the same team, we're on the same team here. We are speaking the same language. And it doesn't matter that we have different religions. Like, who cares that we have different religions? And even in our different religions, we're the same. You know, we each like our holidays and our food and our families and our get-togethers and our music. And we like the same things. All of us want the same things. We want to get together on holidays and sit down and have a good meal with our family and friends. We all want the same thing. Our religions aren't even that different, you know? And so, like, it just felt like the dominant language here of militarism, of violence, is just so wrong. And like women have the ability to change this, to, you know, we don't yet have the real power yet. We're not around the table, and that's really problematic. I mean, even yesterday, did you see Marco Rubio? He said, you know, if Hamas doesn't stop by Shabbat,
Yeah.
we're going to destroy them. We're going to destroy Hamas. And I was just like you're such an idiot. I mean, I'm sorry. I really shouldn't talk. I'm from New York, okay? So like that's my New Yorker coming out, okay? But I'm just saying, like, you don't think that that's exactly what Bibi has been shouting that he's doing since October 7th? We're going to destroy Hamas. You can't destroy Hamas, okay? You can't. And every time we bomb the hell out of Gaza, you're just creating more terrorists, which we know now because terrorists who Hamas recruits, there are new Hamas, this is what the IDF has announced recently. Hamas has a whole bunch of new recruits, you know? Because why? Because every time we, you know, destroy an entire community, what do you think we're going to be creating here? Like, what do you think is going to happen to all the people who are like surviving that? Of course, they're going to go and, you know, engage in violence. And so it was so backwards. It's such backwards macho thinking. It's this macho, like, I'm going to show you. And it's like, not only is that so morally wrong and so it also doesn't even work. It's just these
Right.
stupid words that keep us in this endless silent, you know, cycle of violence. And it's like now we have the Trump administration to deal with also. Like we didn't have enough of these like men in power saying these really stupid things. Anyway, so grassroots women are pushing back. We just how to get from this place of grassroots organizing to a place of real power. That is a big question. And that's a big challenge. And I do not have an answer for that, but there are lots of great people working on how to answer that question.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I find so important about not only this book, but also this conversation right here is that you really take your readers and your audience on a journey of how you deconstructed the narratives that you grew up with, how you started asking these questions, how we're even in a place to be sitting here and saying, hey, this narrative that we've been told our whole lives has some holes in it, and we should really try and figure out what's beyond it. You really put a spotlight on what that process can look like,
Yeah.
and that it's really not as simple as people think what they think and they believe that what they're taught, and that's the end of that. Especially in our space and in our current political era, both here in the US, where you are in Israel. I mean, there's so much deconstruction that has to happen, whether that's
Yeah.
undoing that really old school Zionist conditioning that we're taught in Sunday school
Yeah.
and youth group and yeshiva for some folks, or what I know a number of political organizers who call ex-evangelical, undoing
Oh,
what they're taught on the Christian side of things here in the US. And you make it really clear in the book that it is neither a slow process nor an immediate one. So
yeah.
I think my question here is, what would you say to the people who are in their 20s and 30s, or even folks who are in their 40s and 50s who are just coming around to this idea of, hey, how do I grapple with all of this stuff? Who are
Yeah.
just starting to figure out how to question what they've been told their whole lives.
Yeah. Yeah. People who are already starting to question, that's already great. You know, people who are questioning, just keep questioning, you know, just keep questioning and hang on to empathy. You know, hang on to the empathy. Empathy is at the core. Empathy and compassion are at the core. Human beings is human beings, not to put human beings into caricatures, just to be present with another human being, whether it's in person or whether you're seeing someone online or just hearing stories like that is really at the core. I would say there's also something else that's a little bit harder, which is that a lot of the reason why people don't go there to the place of empathy has to do with two things. One is fear, right? A lot of people are too afraid, you know, and also we're living in a time of like very real fears. And so the fear becomes like an excuse. It becomes like, well, I can't, we're in survival mode. You're so in survival mode and, brain, whatever. And so I would really encourage people to try to move past that. Acknowledge the fear. Okay, we're afraid. Yes, I understand. We're always afraid. Is it possible to hang on to your humanity while you're afraid? That's challenging. Okay, it's not easy to say while I'm afraid and while I'm in trauma, we're all in trauma, to say, okay, I'm in trauma, yes, and still I'm going to remember that I'm a human being. Not to go from the place of like, I'm so traumatized, therefore it's all their fault, to a place of like justifying violence and all that stuff. That's hard. And that to me, is the real work, is to try to stay away from, also to try to stay away from statements like all X are this, all women are this, all Palestinians are this, all Gazans are this, all men are this, all Jews are this, all, you know, any statement that says all X are is by definition wrong. And we do tons of that. Our political culture does tons of that, not only in our context, social, again, it's also part of the Trump culture that has totally legitimized that kind of talk, so we have to fight against that too. And in ourselves to resist the temptation to sort of say, well, all Gazans are guilty. You hear that all the time. I hear this all the time. And I'm like, 10,000 children were killed. They're all Hamas. They're all Hamas terrorists. Like babies. We've killed thousands of babies. They're Hamas terrorists. So I try to like challenge this idea of like all, and also try to, work on humanizing, find common, common, common humanity. But these are not necessarily easy. And again, we're fighting against really powerful forces in our culture, political forces that are legitimizing this. The White House legitimizes this and has been since 2016 effectively. And that's really hard. And the BB Trump bromance there, they're cut from the same cloth. It's the same thing. So it's hard. This is the work. This is the work. And also, one more thing I would also add to that, which is something that I discovered when I was writing about sexual abuse. It's hard to find allies in people for whom the system works. Meaning, like, there are people for whom the system works. They have their job, they have their power, they have their seat. And people are very reluctant to give up their seat, their job, their status, their salary, their corner office, whatever it is. Whatever it is that makes them feel strong and important and secure and okay in the world, people don't necessarily want to challenge that in order to like, do good or whatever. And that's something that I come up against a lot. And again, in a totally different context of like sexual abuse, you discover that high profile abusers get high profile support. Trump, now that he's in the White House, gets lots of all of these high profile people. They want to, be adjacent to power. People like being adjacent to power. And that sort of desire to be in power or to be adjacent to power really blocks a lot of this work of humanization and humanization and empathy. Like, I think to myself, the fact that I was fired from that job worked. It helped me care less. I didn't care about my job. I didn't have a job. I didn't have any connections. I had sort of nothing to lose. And so I was free to sort of think what I wanted to think. But if I had stayed in that job, I would have been trapped by the trappings of wanting to keep my job. And
Right.
so that's hard. That's a very big social, dynamic where people really like their jobs and they like their place in shul. They like their friends and they like their place in the community. And speaking out in a different way is risky. You may be told that you're mentally unwell or that you should just go back to being a grandmother. You can lose a lot. So we just have to like just be aware of that dynamic also. I'm not saying to like fire people or make them purposefully uncomfortable, but just be aware that it's uncomfortable to challenge everything you were brought up with. It's not, who wants to do that? Who wants to be the outsider? So just to sort of like be aware of that. That's a big fear. That's almost as big of a fear as another October 7th. People are terrified of being alone. They're terrified of being without community. They're terrified of being kicked out of shul or whatever it is that gives you meaning. So just sort of like, those are the things we're up against. But again, this is the work. And the work is recognizing those fears, recognizing those concerns in ourselves, and saying, nevertheless, she persisted. Nevertheless, we're going to find our humanity. We're going to hang on. to our humanity. We're going to insist on our own humanity and on the humanity of others.
I really love that as an answer.
Thank you so much, Elana.
Thank you. I think that we're actually just a little bit over time, so I think we need to wrap it up. Elana, thank you so much for being here with us. Karen, thank you for taking the time out of your day to be here in this conversation. We've had a couple of questions in the chat, just where can we find the book? Where can we find more New Jewish Narrative podcasts? I want to quickly go through those. If you want to keep up with various NJN events, you can always follow us on social media. We're on, all the big standard platforms. I'm not going to call it X. It's still Twitter in my brain. We're still on Facebook, Instagram, on Blue Sky. If you want to look at recorded previous webinars, you can always look for our YouTube. Again, we're New Jewish Narrative on there. If you want to check out the wonderful podcast that we were talking about just a little while ago, it's Women Ending War. You can find that on most podcast platforms, along with Peacecast, where you can find the audio of all of our previous podcasts. And if you want to read My Jewish State, if you have somehow sat through an hour-long webinar about the book and have not yet read it, we do have a link to it on the registration page for this webinar, and we will have it on our website along with the links to the podcast and the YouTube and the transcript. So thank you all very, very much. And I think
Thank you, Max and Karen and everybody who's here. I really appreciate the conversation. It brings me hope and optimism.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.